Today we're going to talk about the foundations of our faith, noting particularly how the faith foundations have been tested and how in the modern era there was an attempt to build a new or alternative foundation on the paradigm of science. In this quest for a scientific civilization, we will note three important things that tended to get lost, that were very vital to the foundations of the Christian faith. They were, 1, the loss of purpose, 2, the loss of mystery and wonder, and 3, the loss of absolute truth and value. The Apostle Paul admonished the church at Rome to understand the present time, to be aware of the times in which it lived and ministered. Paul's admonition has never been more urgent for the church than it is today. Our task as Christians is not only to save souls, but to save minds, to help believers better understand the foundations of their faith. In times like ours, Christians desperately need to understand and withstand the intellectual and cultural currents that affect how people think and act. As Charles Malick, a Christian philosopher and statesman, once noted, no individual conversion is complete until a Christian mind has been formed in that person. If we are to be faithful to our task and relevant to our times, we must understand the faith foundations and the fundamental issues and problems of our world. This has been an ongoing challenge for believers throughout the centuries. The faith foundations were severely tested in biblical times. The psalmist cried out against the crumbling of the foundations of righteousness in his day in Psalm 11 and Psalm 73. Job struggled against despair in the midst of what seemed like meaningless suffering. Habakkuk searched for meaning in history when the wicked Assyrians and the Babylonians were allowed to deport and enslave the Israelites. New Testament believers rose up time and again against attempts to reinterpret and modify the faith that had once and for all been delivered to the saints. There was never an attitude in the early church that anything goes, that faith is a matter of private opinion. Throughout the New Testament, we find stern warnings against evil men who subvert the truth, deceitful spirits and heretics who have departed from the faith. There are frequent rebukes of the Judaizers, Gnostics, false brethren, philosophy, and empty deceit. Wherever and in whatever form there were attempts to falsify or modify the faith foundations of the apostolic witness, faithful men of God rose up to defend the truth. Heresy was primarily an attack upon truth from inside the church. It was difficult to deal with heretics because they did not see themselves as subverters of the truth, but as good interpreters of the Christian message. It therefore became necessary to emphasize the right content and formulation of the faith, as well as proper Christian behavior, so that false doctrines and manifestations of the faith could not be passed off as legitimate forms of Christianity. The testing of the faith took place outside the church through persecution and pagan influence. Christianity did not arise in a secularized, non-religious world. It arose in an environment of sects and cults, fed by religious myths, pagan mystery religions, secular philosophies, and emperor worship. Rome was a pluralistic society. Almost any religion could be tolerated that did not threaten the unity and tranquility of the empire. The one thing Rome could not tolerate was a monotheistic faith with absolute claims. Christians were not a problem because they were too religious. They were a problem because they steadfastly held to their faith in one God and the absolute claims of Christian revelation. Refusing to worship Roman emperors who claimed to be deities, Christians had their legal rights suspended, and thousands were martyred for their faith. In the absence of a true transcendent deity, Roman society tried to hold itself together by deifying itself. Christian martyrs were burned and nailed to crosses. Others were scourged until their veins and arteries were exposed. Many were devoured by lions and wild beasts. But in spite of terrible persecution, the majority of Christians remained faithful and true to the foundations laid down by the prophets and the apostles. They understood the spiritual demands of their time and remained faithful at the risk of their own lives. In 311 A.D., the Emperor Galerius recognized that persecution had failed and issued an edict of toleration, making Christianity a legal religion in the East. The following year, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, and in 313 A.D. issued the Edict of Milan that legalized Christianity throughout the empire. During the reign of Theodosius I, Christianity became the official religion of the empire and began to profit from its favored status over the pagan cults. The tide had turned. The long battle against persecution had been won, but a new threat from within loomed large on the horizon. In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor was deposed, and the collapse of the Roman Empire left a power vacuum that soon began to be filled by the Christian church. By this time, the church had become much more organized and institutionalized. It was growing in numbers and was poised to convert, by persuasion or by sword, masses of pagan barbarians scattered throughout the empire. What had begun as a small sectarian movement in Palestine, living in expectation of the imminent return of Jesus Christ, was in a few centuries a powerful institutional church with its head in Rome. As the church rushed in to fill the vacuum created by the collapse of Rome, it increasingly found itself engaged in the quest for worldly power and splendor. Its worldly interest oftentimes overshadowed the church's claim to be a spiritual authority. The political and economic foundations of the church were increasingly enlarged and strengthened by worldly support, but the purity and mission of the faith was compromised. The church's roots and foundations were soon being nourished more by its lust for power and glory than the grace and favor of God. We often think of the Middle Ages as an age of faith, but the faith was not on a solid foundation. Rome tried to build a foundation for faith and spiritual authority on apostolic succession, but they did so on the basis of power, position, and office. The church failed to see that the only true claim to the apostolic vocation is a faithful witness to Jesus Christ. Any claim to standing in apostolic succession that is based on power, pride, or self-assurance is a contradiction to true apostolic witness. The real apostles were beaten and cast out before they were raised up and sent out to witness to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Their commission arose from their gifting with the power of the Holy Spirit for witness to Jesus Christ, but only after their own self-confidence had been shattered. Criticism of the institutional church grew throughout the Middle Ages, but there were differences of opinion as to its real problem. Some saw the problem as a matter of misplaced authority. Others believed that the church had become too caught up in external rituals and superstitious practices. Others held that the real problem was the church's view of itself. Cry for reform came from many quarters, but it was Martin Luther, the great German reformer, who rightly perceived the problem of the church. He insisted that the biblical theological foundations of the faith had been eroded and replaced by layers of tradition, superstition, and reason. Corrupt theology over time had been substituted for the truth of the gospel. Martin Luther's contribution, as well as that of the other great reformers, was the recognition of the Scriptures as the only true authority for faith. The Protestant Reformation, in its many forms throughout Europe, was essentially an attempt to return the church to the original faith foundation on which it had been founded. Throughout the centuries, the Christian faith had been severely tested. Christians were called upon to combat heresies, to refute false teachers, undergo persecution, and live through long periods of corruption and distortion on the part of the church itself. Still, the faith had to face what would prove to be its most severe test, the so-called Age of Enlightenment, which gave birth to the modern world would bring into question the core assumptions and truths upon which the Christian faith rested. The supernatural, historical, and absolute character of the Christian faith had never been seriously questioned in the Western world, but this would change. As we shall see, the spirit of Enlightenment thinking, that is primarily during the 17th and 18th centuries, radically challenged the classic formulations of the Christian faith. The metaphysical and historical foundations upon which the faith had rested for centuries would be thoroughly undermined by the modern consciousness that was emerging through new paradigms of thinking in the area of science, philosophy, and history. Heretofore, the old foundations had been tested. Modernism would represent a quest for alternative foundations. We want to talk now about that quest for a new scientific civilization. The early prophets of modern science, Francis Bacon and René Descartes, dreamed of a scientific civilization where the welfare of humankind could be abundantly enhanced through the accumulation of scientific knowledge. Bacon's claim that knowledge is power was demonstrated early in the modern era as the scientific method and technological progress combined to produce an industrial revolution, transform the meaning of war, conquer plagues and diseases, and raise the material standard of living throughout the Western world. The accumulation of scientific knowledge and technological advance were not in themselves a threat to the Christian faith. Except for a few notable examples, Christians did not stand in opposition to the advancement of science, nor was the Christian view of things a hindrance to the scientific method. On the contrary, many of the early outstanding scientists were Christian believers, and the Christian view of nature was what actually made the scientific enterprise possible. On the ethical and moral side of things, it was the Christian perspective that made it clear that knowledge could be used for both good and evil, and that for science to be safe, it needed to be grounded in an ethic that valued human life and the divine purpose for humankind. A science used only to further political and material goals would indeed be dangerous. As science increasingly removed itself from Christian truth and values, however, it changed the way moderns thought about themselves and the world in which they lived. At the heart of this change was a loss of divine meaning and purpose for man and the world, an attempt to eliminate wonder and mystery from the universe, and the abolition of absolute truths and values upon which the Christian faith was grounded. From the middle of the 17th century onward, science was generally accepted as the main force in the advancement of Western civilization. The discoveries of Galileo, Copernicus, and Kepler in astronomy laid a new foundation for thinking about man and his place in the universe. Prior to the 17th century, Western man lived in a world understood in terms of the old Ptolemaic system, with its Earth-centered universe, circled by rotating, concentric, impenetrable, crystalline spheres, to which were attached the sun, planets, and fixed stars. It was a glorious universe in which the redemption of man on earth was central. The heavens sparkled with hope, and God gave order and meaning to all that existed. Copernicus revolutionized this concept of things with his sun-centered view of the universe. In the new conception of the universe, the earth rotated around the sun, was relatively insignificant in size, and the heavens were without their glory and splendor. The planet that man now inhabited seemed relatively insignificant compared to the infinite empty spaces of the universe. Man was no longer central in the creative and redemptive scheme of things. This view would be reinforced in the 19th century as Darwin's theory of evolution further reduced man's significance to a biological species that had somehow managed to survive the ravages of time and space. There was no reason, from a Copernican or Darwinian point of view, to believe that man occupied any exceptional place on the planet. The supreme achievement of Enlightenment science, however, was the scientific synthesis of Isaac Newton, who brought Kepler's and Galileo's laws of motions together with Descartes' materialism so that everything in nature, including humankind, could be understood to operate like a machine. Modern materialism, that is the view that matter with its motions and qualities is the ultimate reality of all things, had been born. It is important not to miss the full force of the argument that the universe is like a vast machine that operates like billiard balls, where everything happens according to strict natural laws. In this view, there is no divine or human purpose to what goes on in the universe. Everything that happens does so according to the impersonal laws of nature. It is not through the power of divine or human will that things occur in time and space, but by predetermined chains of blind, irrational, antecedent causes. In this materialistic and mechanistic view, the brain secretes thought in the same way that the liver secretes bile. The soul is an empty word, signifying nothing more than the part of us that thinks. Humans, like the universe in which they live, are nothing more than matter in motion, governed by mechanistic laws. Thinking, feeling, purposing, valuing, and willing are all phenomena governed by blind, impersonal laws. It has been said that the revolution in thought that occurred from Copernicus to Newton was the greatest spiritual adjustment that humankind has ever had to make. The old universe, inhabited by spiritual beings, governed by divine purpose, where humans were the center of creation and redemption, no longer existed in the new scientific paradigm. The beauty and purpose of the old heavens were exploded into the darkness of endless space. Man was no longer a creature of purpose and dignity, but a meaningless material object. A created world with a sacred history, existing under the sovereignty and governance of God, seemed less and less congruent with the view of the world put forth by modern science. In a world conceived to be without divine purpose, it was becoming increasingly difficult to establish a why to live for. For many, the story of salvation that had given meaning and hope to humankind for centuries no longer seemed viable in an age of enlightened science. The loss of mystery and wonder. The elimination of mystery and wonder was the goal toward which both science and philosophy began to work in the modern era. Modern science arose through the combination of mathematical precision, Descartes, and the experimental method, Bacon. The new role of the scientist was to provide accurate knowledge. The role of the philosopher was to clarify thinking. Unlike Greek science, which tended to end in wonder, modern science had the effect of expelling wonder through knowledge. Nature increasingly came under the control of human manipulation. New inventions and technologies totally changed the way people lived, worked, and waged war. In many cases, they vastly improved the human condition. In other instances, they completely demoralized the human spirit, as science and technology were used as instruments of greed and political power. The nature and destructive power of war was totally changed through advances in science and technology, and the modern factory system flourished at the expense of wretched workers living in filthy slums, selling their bodies and their souls for meager materialistic gains. It was not the failure, but the success of modern science that proved to be so problematic. Science, in effect, represented a new master and a new set of temptations for modern man. The lure of what the new master promised was often too much of a temptation for its devotees. As C.S. Lewis noted in The Abolition of Man, before the age of modern science, reality was viewed as a given, as an unchangeable truth. The goal was not to control and manipulate reality, but to conform the soul to reality through knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. The goal was submission. From the time of the Enlightenment onward, however, the goal was to master and control the environment. This is what Francis Bacon meant when he spoke of knowledge as power. What René Descartes meant when he suggested that the new science would make men the lords and possessors of nature. With man, through the power of reason, now enthroned as the master of nature, the old feeling of dependence upon God lost much of its force. It was no longer necessary to assign to God what supposedly could be explained through reason and the laws of nature. There was no need to submit to authorities such as the Bible, the church, or tradition, whose claims could not be warranted by the evidence of science. Miracles and wonders, understood as events that contravene natural law, and the direct agency of God in human history, that is, divine providence, could be given different meanings and interpretations. There was simply no spirit of repentance, that is, submission, on the part of the Enlightenment intellect. The false presumption of science was that it could somehow plumb the depths of truth and reality. The scientist was commonly stereotyped as an unbiased observer who simply sits passively before the facts of nature, when in reality it is not a passive process at all. It was often overlooked that it is the scientist who puts his or her questions to nature. Experiments are devised to give answers to questions that interest the scientist. This is what the experimental method is all about. Truth and reality are confined to what science can discover about questions that interest the scientist. What science cannot know is what lies outside these limits, namely God. The temptation of science is to apply the scientific method to that which is not subject to either the scientific method or the questions of the scientist. Its sin is its refusal to submit to the one who is the author of all facts, as well as their meaning. The human intellect, when faced with God and the mysteries that the mind cannot plumb or penetrate, must yield to the conviction that it is totally inadequate, just as one senses moral inadequacy through a sense of sin. God is disclosed through Christ in the Scriptures. He even speaks through the glory of his creation. He speaks, but all do not hear. Some eyes are mysteriously opened, others are not. Scientific evidence is based on the assumption that its knowledge is universally communicable and repeatable. This assumption, however, is not applicable to revealed truth. Supernatural facts are simply not accessible to scientific investigation. The demand for scientific evidence on scientific terms cannot be applied to divine truth, for revelation is something that some will see, while others will not. One cannot scientifically understand or explain the wonders of God's universe, the uniqueness of divine revelation, or the mysterious working of the Holy Spirit. The loss of absolute truth and value. Confidence in science and technology grew dramatically during the 19th and 20th centuries. For most, advances in areas like medicine, surgery, technology, space travel, and computers made the triumph of science a foregone conclusion. Things previously thought impossible, or more akin to science fiction, were becoming commonplace in Western society. In some areas, more scientific progress was taking place in the span of a single decade than had taken place during the whole of human history. While the average person was being awed by the capabilities of science and the comforts that it afforded, others were deeply concerned about the precarious nature of the scientific enterprise. Where, for example, would the development of atomic power lead? What would be the future of genetic engineering? What kind of toll would scientific advance have upon the environment? Would modern technology, like some Frankenstein monster, grow beyond human control? Meanwhile, new disciplines like psychology, sociology, and anthropology were growing in importance and were quick to identify with the prestige of science. This, of course, entailed a commitment to empirically based methodologies that soon revolutionized these disciplines. Whereas Sigmund Freud and his followers, for example, had concentrated on the subconscious and irrational factors that motivate human behavior, the new schools of psychology in the tradition of Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner shunned the analysis of interior states in favor of more scientifically based observations of external behavior. Their basic assumption was that human behavior is essentially determined by its environment and occurs in a rather mechanistic way. The person that emerged from this line of thought was not a unique being with freedom and dignity, but a complex bodily machine without a soul or mind. It was an organism manipulated by its environment and made susceptible to a technology of behavior based on positive and negative reinforcement. In the words of B.F. Skinner, the problem is not to induce people to be good, but to behave well. In this view, the human organism is not free. Consequently, it cannot transcend its natural limitations. On the other hand, because it is not free and has been shaped by its environment, it is not really responsible for what it has become. The consequence of this kind of psychology was soon filtering down to the general culture, where it was becoming generally assumed that human behavior, previously regarded as bad or wrong behavior, could be redefined as normal or acceptable behavior or attributed to environmental influences. The abolition of man as a unique, free, and responsible creature left in its wake a culture of victimization where someone else or something else is always seen to be responsible for one's problems. Instead of taking personal responsibility for one's actions, it became more acceptable than ever to blame bad behavior, even crime, on societal and environmental influences. Litigation and entitlement skyrocketed as victims sought redress from society and those deemed responsible for their deeds. Sociology and anthropology were also growing in importance as empirically based disciplines. Divine transcendence was, for the most part, replaced in these disciplines with scientific humanism. Religion could only be viewed as a human projection, an attempt to project ultimate meaning into the natural world and the institutions of society. Sociologists emphasize that all reality is socially constructed, while cultural anthropologists stress the relativism of all societies and cultures. Each culture has its own set of values. What is valued as good in one culture may not be valued as good in another. The idea that there are superior cultures or hierarchies of cultural values could only be treated as cultural imperialism and an impingement upon the social contingencies of cultures and societies different from one's own. Cultural relativism was expected of all as a tolerant alternative to missionary zeal. Belief in absolute truths and values, together with any attempt to convert others to them, was soon regarded as provincial narrow-mindedness and carried with it a stigma that few were willing to oppose in academic and political circles. The positivist attitude, that is to say, the view that intellectual inquiry must be confined to observable, positive facts that prevailed in the natural, social, and behavioral disciplines, soon expressed itself in philosophy through a movement known as logical positivism. But at a time, philosophy had traditionally been a search for wisdom, a quest for absolute answers. But at a time when moderns needed truth and value more than ever, philosophers began abandoning all attempts to provide ultimate answers. Instead, they began to redefine their task as that of clarifying words and statements, that is to say, linguistic analysis. A.J. Ayer, a leading logical positivist, suggested that no real problems exist except the factual problems of science. All problems that cannot be reduced to empirical, testable statements and thus solved by the empirical investigator are pseudo-problems that are either non-existent or can be dismissed as so much empty wind. Matters like God, freedom, purpose, morals, and other concerns that occupied human attention for centuries were, in the view of logical positivists, non-verifiable concerns that can never be solved or even intelligently discussed. As one observer noted, it is one thing to be told that you are wrong. It is something else to be told that you were not saying anything meaningful at all. But this is precisely what theologians and ethicists were being told by logical positivists. The point in bringing views from the various academic disciplines into our discussion is to make it abundantly clear that what is at stake in the modern world is the question of truth. To the strict empiricist, and one must remember that most of the disciplines taught in a modern university are taught from an empiricist perspective, all claims about God, freedom, purpose, ethics, and the soul are essentially meaningless statements. These are only statements of feeling or emotion, or what is meaningful to the individual. Theological and ethical statements like God is love or adultery is wrong can only be viewed as a way of looking at things or expressing one's subjective emotions. The bottom line is that whatever cannot be empirically verified has to be regarded as being on the same cognitive level as statements like, I hate broccoli, or I love my cat. Religious beliefs and moral statements from this perspective carry no more cognitive significance than one's feelings about their hobby or their necktie. It is all mere preference or taste. One only has to watch a few talk shows or sitcoms on television where the values of the culture are visibly and freely expressed to see that these views are not restricted to classrooms in modern universities. Moderns in general do not believe in truth. There is no moral compass. The question is no longer, is it right or is it true, but does it work or how do you feel about it? People who talk about rightness and wrongness are routinely laughed at, scorned, and treated as narrow-minded bigots. Alan Bloom, in the introduction of his best-selling The Closing of the American Mind, writes that there is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that truth is relative.